Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. I'm Mr. Giant and I'm back with some more vibes for all you. And in lieu of everything that's going on right now, with the conflict going on in Ukraine and all of that, I decided let me take a look at this country and see. So I'm gonna watch the animated history of the Ukraine. You know what I mean, and just lighten it up a little bit because I'm doing an animated version for that reason. Because everything is so serious and all of that. You know what I mean, and it is serious. Trust me, it is. I've been bombed before. I know how that feels. But let's go ahead and YouTube and Sim and see about the history of this place.
Order yours
Ukraine.
now before they run out, or get one for free by signing up at Patreon like all of these nice people. This episode is supported by Raycon, a wireless earbud company co-founded by Ray J and many other titans of the music industry at about half the price of the leading premium brands. Head to buyraycon.com/SUIBHNE to get a further 15% off your order, which will also help support this channel. Ukrainian identity long precedes the formation of any nation-state on this soil. The modern geopolitical entity and the current Ukrainian crisis can all trace their roots back to the land's unique geography and some of Europe's most fascinating cultures. An identity that has its foundations in no less than 3 geographic features: the Eurasian steppes, the Dnieper River, and of course, the Black Sea. These 3 very important parts of Ukraine not only shape its culture and identity, but have also made Ukraine a pawn in the strategic and economic games of larger powers, especially between Russia and the West. During the centuries of Russian hegemony, this was less of a problem. Monarchs and autocrats don't really care much for identity politics after all. But post-independence, the centuries of influence from outside powers have started to show. But Ukraine has its own nationhood and a story that goes all the way back to the migration of nomads through the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Well, it's been a long time coming, the remake of my old Ukraine video. Let's see if I can get it right this time. Now I know what you're thinking, doesn't Ukraine's history begin with the Slavic migrations? And the answer is kind of yes, but the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppes are inseparable from Ukraine's early development. A steppe, in geographic terms, if you're not aware, lends itself almost exclusively to the development of nomadic societies. They lack geographic boundaries for defense, materials for building, and the grazing patterns of animals mean that, well, you go where the food goes. This is one of the reasons why the horse was domesticated in the steppes. It made travel and hunting easier, and facilitated the raiding of rival tribes. And if a horde got big enough, it might start raiding, say, the crumbling Roman Empire. Hordes of Alans, Huns, Avars, Bulgars, and Khazars had passed through this area on their way to the rich lands of Rome, and each had left a massive influence on the Slavs and directly caused their migrations in the first place. If you think about it, the only place being worse than Rome would have been like anything on the way to Rome. Next is our second geographic feature, the Dnieper River, which means we get to talk about Vikings. Now, the lands of the Slavs, you see, were pretty irresistible to the Swedish Vikings. No centralized control, tons of wealth to raid and trade for, and hundreds of miles of long navigable rivers through it all, at the end of which lies the jackpot itself, Constantinople. It wasn't long before these Norsemen, who the Slavs called Rus.
I never thought of rivers as being so big that nomadic tribes travel through these rivers and pillage and have wars and stuff. Being from an island, right? We don't have large rivers. So I'm always fascinated by it, to think that people use large rivers to migrate like that, you know what I mean, and fight wars, according to the river banks and stuff like that. I never really fathomed that idea.
Had built a huge trade empire centered on the Dnieper River, an old Khazar trading post called Kiev. Now, of course, the Slavs did eventually expel the Vikings from their land, but then quite ironically, politely asked them to return and rule them, which began the medieval state known as the Kievan Rus. To try and create some unity through religion, Prince Vladimir the Great sent envoys to all the neighboring lands to study their various faiths, who reported that the Jews had lost Israel and therefore couldn't possibly be a blessed people. The Muslim Bulgars were sad and stinky, their words, not mine, and also prohibited drinking, to which old Vlad here laughed, saying drinking is the joy of the Rus, before finally settling on Christianity. To be specific, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, ostensibly because of how impressed his envoys were with the Hagia Sophia, but between you and me, I think they were just trying to suck it up to the Byzantines. His son, who had become known as Yaroslav the Wise, greatly expanded the prosperity of the Rus state with Ukraine's oldest body of codified laws. Although the Rus were pretty prosperous, they soon fragmented into regional rival city-states for two main reasons. One was the arrival of the Cumans, who took control of Crimea and severely handicapped their trade routes, and two was the decline of its most wealthy ally, Constantinople, thanks to a little event called the Fourth Crusade. You really can trace a lot of Europe's history to this event, huh? Due to increased infighting, the Rus cities were at their weakest point in decades, and so probably wouldn't deal very well with, say, a horde of more than 30,000 mounted archers from Mongolia.
Hey, you know what? He mentioned the Crusades. Do me a favor. If you know of a really good series to watch about the Crusades and stuff like that, let's go with the most famous one. And I don't know which one that is. You know what I mean? Which one was more influential in the forming of places and stuff like that, or the ideology of places, you know? Comment down below and let me know. I would really like to, because I've been hearing about the Crusades since I was a kid, but I've never really delved into it, and I really would like to, so hook up a brethren.
Ooh, just their rotten luck. The part I want to focus on here during an era called the Mongol-Tatar yoke is not so much the rapid rise of the Golden Horde, which made the Rus its glorified cash cow through extortion, but rather its inevitable and arguably more important collapse, because in what was the medieval Rus state, three regional powers would come to fill the Mongol vacuum, forever driving a wedge between the northeast and the southwest. Moscow would consolidate in the north, becoming the genesis of the Russian state, but for Ukraine, that genesis was in Lithuania. It's hard to conceptualize this today, but the Lithuanian state once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, later forming a union with Poland, absorbing swathes of those old Mongol Rus lands, which in Latin they called Ruthenia. This was the turning point for the lands of the Rus controlled by the West, diverging from those controlled by Moscow. Through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, what would become Ukraine had a direct line to Western philosophy and liturgy, with the Greek Catholic, or Uniate Church, flourishing in this period, whereas Moscow was isolated and inherited its autocratic rule from the Mongols. Even more so, symbolically, Moscow saw itself as the Third Rome, the defender of the Orthodox faith, which further alienated it from the West. Then we have our third regional power, the Crimean Khanate, a rump state of the Mongol-influenced Cumans, whom the Slavs simply called Tatars. And here we get to talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of Ukrainian history. With the introduction of serfdom, a more severe form of feudalism, thousands of peasants fled to the vast, open, sparsely populated frontiers to escape subjugation. Embracing their nomadic roots, living off the land free and fairly, they constructed a whole society with refugees, peasants, escaped serfs and slaves, Tatars, Ruthenians, Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims alike. They would become perhaps the most important piece of Ukraine's identity, the Cossacks. It's hard for me to overstate
Cossacks
just how
again.
powerful the Cossacks became. Not only were they instrumental in leveraging their autonomy and powerful armies in service of the Polish crown, but they became inseparable from the idea of self-determination. The roots of Ukrainian ideas of independence were the Cossacks. And if they weren't treated the way they wanted to be, as equal autonomous partners, then they would be more than happy to fight on behalf of someone else. An opportunity they soon took during the Second Northern War. The Northern Wars were a long series of not altogether related events, but basically amounted to these four powers butting heads for more territory, especially over the Baltic Sea. But the part we're going to focus on is the Khmelnytsky Uprising, and for this we have Joe from the channel Jabzy.
Although the Cossacks had formed a close bond with the Commonwealth and had participated in numerous wars against the Turks and Tatars, the spirit of independence within their homeland, the Zaporozhian Sich, lived on. Tensions had reached a boiling point when King of Poland, John Casimir II, treated the Sich with contempt and made efforts to curtail their autonomy, spurred by many local Cossack uprisings. When wars broke out between the empires of Russia, Sweden and Poland-Lithuania, the Cossacks took the opportunity to assert their independence and revolted under the leadership of Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky, aligning themselves with Moscow. To this day, it is still unclear whether the treaty between the Tsar and the Cossacks aimed for further integration within the Russian Empire, or simply as a temporary military cooperation. But the Russian Empire's growth in the 18th century would ensure that Russia's interests would soon dominate. However, right-bank Ukraine still remained loyal to the Commonwealth, and when the left-bank Cossacks invaded Poland on the side of Russia, it set off a series of brutal atrocities remembered in Poland as the Deluge, and in right-bank Ukraine it is known as the Ruin. This pivotal event would not only weaken the Commonwealth as a regional power, but also result in the creation of a Cossack hegemony within the ironically far more...
It's raining pretty heavy here. Can you hear that hitting the roof? It's raining pretty heavy here.
heavy-handed rule of the Russian
Nice.
Tsars. And if you'd like to learn more about this period, come check out my video on the Khmelnytsky uprising over on my channel Jabzy.
Now basically from the onset of the uprising, the Cossacks were treated with a certain degree of suspicion by the Russians. They were all too happy to use them to defend against Tatar raids and even to aid them in their conquest of Siberia, but the Tsars knew all too well that a Cossack revolt could spell absolute disaster if they ever lost the Hetmanate's favor. All the Cossacks wanted was independence, and Russia simply couldn't allow that to happen. Their fears were pretty well founded, as it turns out, since the Cossacks again switched sides in support of Sweden during the Great Northern War, but this time at the disastrous Battle of Poltava. The Cossack host was defeated, and from this point on, the seeds of malicious distrust in Ukraine had been sown.
Oh, wow.
Russian control over the Cossacks
So this has been going on for
and Lithuanians
centuries.
in general would slowly increase over time, accelerated by the partitions of Poland, where all of Ukraine, save for Galicia, found itself under Russia.
See, this is what people don't understand here. This is not just popping up here. This has been going on for a long time. You know what I mean? It's been going on for a long time. This mistrust and all of that has been going on forever. But people just think that we're so egotistical in these modern times that we think that everything we do affects everything else, not taking into consideration what came in the past and what created the situation that we're in right now. Or what, how should I say, not so much created it, but facilitated it. You know what I'm saying? And we sitting here thinking, oh yeah, they don't like us, or we don't like them, and you know, blah, blah. But it's just like, it's been going on forever. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying it's right or anything like that. You would think that us being like a rational, intelligent being, we could come to some kind of understanding and not let the same thing keep happening again. Not let the same mistrust come up over and over and over again. You know what I mean? Because most people who are living now really don't care about, they want to know it, but they don't really care about back then. They want to live now. They want to love their family. They want to live life and thing. You know what I mean? And we just constantly keep doing that, fighting and invading and doing guerrilla warfare on each other. And it just keeps happening and happening and happening. So obviously this isn't working. So then what are we going to do to just have like a kind of a peace? And then of course a lot of people would say, you know, when a certain country takes over another country, then there's some kind of peace and stuff, and they do this and they do that and they do the other. But is it really? Because then, you know, there's going to be some kind of discrimination going on, you know, because hey, you were conquered. There's people that's going to feel better than thou, you know what I mean? Nobody ever talks, you know what, on a flip side of this year, no, not already related, but nobody ever talks about peace anymore. If I mention peace on my Facebook page, crickets. It doesn't get any likes, nothing. But let me mention some kind of drama or some kind of craziness, or let me pick a political side and watch people explode, hundreds of likes and comments and stuff like that. But if you mention peace and love, nothing. It's like people have forgotten the concept of peace and love anymore. Or they just don't care. Or people just want peace, but they want peace as long as they control what the peace is. As long as they control what to tell other people is good for everybody. It's just crazy, man. You know, nobody talks about peace anymore. I'm going to talk about it though. I want peace. And you notice the most people that don't want to talk about peace is the people who think that they live in relative peace because they have never been bombed. They've never been in a war. They've never been in a revolution. They've never been in an invasion. They don't talk about peace because they think that they're living in peace right now, but the amount of stress that's going on with everything else that's going on where other places aren't living in peace, that's not peace of mind. And then we have the polytricksters using that uncertainty to their advantage to make more money, or to control, or to confuse, or to keep uneducated, ultimately to brainwash. And if you mention peace, here you're weak. Or you're a crazy liberal. Oh, your mother must have raised you. Yeah, my mother raised me, and she taught me about peace. I learned about, you know what I mean, to be peaceful with people. So I don't get into fights. I don't even argue with people. I tell them a point, they disagree. The minute they start yelling, I'm outdoor. I'm not fighting with you. The fighting don't solve nothing. It might solve it for a time. But you see, and just this history here proves that. This what? 1795. A mistrust since 1795. And we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I know some people are going to go, oh, you don't understand what's going on. No. I understand human beings. Every time they talk about the situation they're here, they go with a political thing. Nobody cares about what's happening to the human beings in the situation. Nobody. I have friends that want to talk about it, but is China going to do this? And what's this person going to do that? Who cares? There's people in the middle of this dying on both sides. On both sides. Those are human beings. We're not paying attention to the human beings that's suffering. We're paying attention to the politics of things. And that's why let's keep watching this.
Rule. There was of course an added benefit to increased control over the Ruthenians, and that was because they stood between them and something the Russians deeply coveted, the Black Sea. From the 15th century onward, it was clear to the Russians that the only way to truly become a world power like those of Western Europe was through a large, powerful navy, but they lacked much in the way of seaports. This was one of the motivations behind the Northern Wars, after all, gaining control of the Baltic Sea. And it wasn't long before Russia started eyeing the Black Sea as well, inconveniently controlled by the Ottomans and the Tatars. One Russo-Turkish war later, Crimea was now easy pickings and annexed in 1783, just in case you thought Russia annexing Crimea was a new phenomenon. As with most of the territories acquired by the Russian Empire, Ukraine was heavily suppressed. Its Cossack hosts lost more and more of their autonomy, the Ruthenian language we now call Ukrainian was banned, and rebellions were violently put down. This was all part of a process known as Russification, and one of its largest proponents was Catherine the Great. Jews were especially affected by these policies, restricted to stay in an area known as the Pale, in small, economically disadvantaged communities called the shtetl, which greatly contributed to the suppression of Jewish culture. Now, although 19th century Russia was succeeding in the spreading of its internal power, the same cannot be said for its place on the world stage, and their intellectual control over Ruthenia would weaken due to several reasons. Firstly was the spreading of the Enlightenment ideas of self-determination during the French Revolution. Secondly, the revolutions of 1848. And thirdly, the very overt demonstration that Russia was not the invincible power it fancied itself. Losing major world conflicts in the disastrous campaigns of the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War had exposed a weakness in the Tsarist regime that had stubbornly lacked reform and industrialization on the scale of other nations. It's not surprising then to see that Ukraine was at the ready to go its own way during the worst conflict Europe was to know at the time, at the outbreak of the First World War, the effects of which would lead to the Russian Civil War. It's worthwhile to remember that the Russian Civil War was by no means a monolith. It was a complicated network of ever-changing alliances, and this is no more evident than in Ukraine, where it is remembered as the Ukrainian War for Independence, an independence they ultimately did not achieve. The anti-Bolshevik White Army allied with some of the Ukrainian nationalists, who in turn had allied with the Second Polish Republic. The Black Army had initially seized swathes of territory to form an anarcho-socialist society before eventually allying with the Bolshevik Reds. And the Bolsheviks even used Ukraine as a bargaining chip to seal a peace with Germany in 1918, but also with Poland in 1921, which is where the borders were ultimately settled on again, splitting Ukraine in two. It was not until the Second World War that West Ukraine would be reunited, by force. I've covered the history of the Soviet Union in a separate video, so I won't go into too much detail about this era here, but I do want to go over some important details in Ukraine's more contemporary development. The first was that of exploitation. Ukraine became a massive center of industrialization and natural resources in the Soviet era, making it a huge target for two of humanity's worst dictators. Not only Hitler during the invasion of the Soviet Union, but also the Soviets' own premier Joseph Stalin, whose land reforms would cause the Great Soviet Famine, known as the Holodomor, which led to the deaths of between 3 and 12 million Ukrainian peasants. A majority of the more than 2 million Soviet Jews who perished in the Holocaust were also from Ukraine, which erased almost all of its historical Jewish community. In Kiev alone, the SS killed more than 30,000 Jews in just 2 days during the infamous Babin Yar massacre. The second is more to do with Ukraine's current geopolitical standpoint, which I think is vital to understanding post-independence Ukraine, which has been in a push and pull in two directions directly linked to its unique geography. The vast open steppes are still envied by the Kremlin, who has lost one of its great buffer zones to NATO. Pro-Western leadership in this young nation has been hamstrung by Russian influence on more than one occasion. Russia wants Ukraine to be a quiet and stable ally, and they've actively supported pro-Russian separatists since 2014. The Dnieper River still forms the nucleus of the nation, and a divide that has gone back centuries by influences from outside powers. The inhabitants on the east of this river are still more likely to identify as and to speak Russian, thanks to centuries of oppression under the Tsars and the Soviet Union. And of course, the Black Sea is still as hotly contested as ever. Fearing Ukraine moving to closer ties with the European Union and the rampant instability of the Ukrainian crisis, Russia illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula to protect its Black Sea ports. The current Ukrainian crisis may feel new, but it's worth remembering that we're not at the end of Ukraine's story, nor are we ever. We're in the middle of its most recent chapter, and conceptualizing its past may help with its future going forward. Thank you to today's sponsor, Raycon.
Had a little bit of technical difficulty there. For some reason, there's a storm going on here and I had a blackout and stuff. But I was almost at the end of the video, so I'm going to splice in. I'm gonna fix it. But anyway, man, thank you all for watching this with me. And like I said, we're all human, man. We got to start looking at that instead of looking at things from a political standpoint or a material standpoint or a capitalistic standpoint or a communistic standpoint. Remember, we created these systems, man. We don't let the systems control us. And that's everybody. I'm not talking about one side or the other. People who's never been bombed, man, try to listen to people who have been. It's not. People act, like for instance, the Ukrainian president, you have all these women around here going, oh, he's sexy, he's this, man. That ain't got nothing to do with it. There's people dying on the ground, and that's what you take from it. Anyway, man, thank you all for watching this with me. I'm going to leave a link in the description to this video. Hope you enjoyed learning something, you know what I mean? And for those who doesn't know much about Ukraine, I hope this helps you understand the whole genesis, I should say, of this situation, okay? Listen, man, we have to start taking care of each other, okay?